Howdy. This tutorial is going to cover overriding the OnPaint function found in the widget's blueprints. So this here we can kind of see as an example of what one effect that you can achieve by overriding the OnPaint. I have pairs of cubes that are being generated on the left-hand side. They move over to the right where they are destroyed as they hit a certain bounding box. And while they're in flight, they are drawing a 2D line to my widget overlay. Additionally, if I hold down the Alt key, I can see an example that you might find in Diablo games or other kind of games where each of these cubes is generating now a 2D, not a 3D, a 2D text box with a word with a different color, maybe it's rarity or something. And it is following the box basically on screen. So when might we want to use this kind of technique or mechanic? Anytime that you're dealing with information that needs to be distance independent, meaning that you, for example, only care about its position on screen, but you don't care about how far away it is from the player or from the viewport. Good examples of this are any games that have these waypoints, or any time you have a nameplate above a character's head, or items that drop on the floor, and you want to give the player an indication of where something is just on the HUD, but you don't want to create a 3D widget in space to have it hover, but you want it to be present on the screen and always be the same size, so it has the same level of importance. This is something that we can do by pushing it to the OnPaint function. So from here on out, let me open up a completely fresh version of Unreal, and we will look at widgets, OnPaint, and we will construct a quick example that will hopefully bring everything together and explain some of the finer points. Okay, here I am in a completely new first-person example map that we have, just as far as a base goes, where I can hit play and I can move around and I can shoot if I want to, that kind of thing. We're going to use this and we're going to make ourselves our widget and look at OnPaint. So I'm going to go to user interface, I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a new widget here. This is going to be my OnPaint override. What I'm going to do real quick first is I'm going to go to my first person blueprint and I am going to inject it using a sequence right at the beginning of my event begin play so that I can make sure it's added to the viewport. We're going to select our OnPaint override and make sure add to viewport. Compile, everything's done on this end. And now we can actually jump inside of it and start working with it and talk about it. So where do you find OnPaint? Well, you go over to Graph, and you will see here in the functions list, just like you would if you were doing parenting and you have any blueprints that are inheriting from other blueprints, you will see it's going to list a number of overridable functions. Well, if I click on this little down arrow, we can see that we have a bunch of these. Here's our destruct. We even have like on drop, on key up, and then down here on paint. So I clicked on that, and here we have the function that will eventually override. You can see by default it's doing nothing in this function. It goes in and it leaves. And it's important to note now then that OnPaint acts very much like an event tick. It will be called every single frame, meaning you needed to treat it with the same respect you would any on-tick event that you create elsewhere, meaning that if you do a lot in here, you're going to really, really bog your game down because of everything it's doing graphically. So for our purposes here, I will be doing a couple things that might not be best practice, but it's just kind of to show you guys how these work. But I want you to be aware that you shouldn't use things like get all actors, that kind of thing, when you are actually working with this and designing a mechanic with it. So we have 4 major building blocks we can actually use in this OnPaint. If you type in draw and you scroll up a little bit, you will see painting, and then you will see draw box, draw line, lines, and text. These are kind of your bread and butter as far as what we have here. I'm going to pull all 4 of these out real quick, and we're going to talk about them. The context node that you are seeing inside of all of these, you'll notice that we actually have a pin here for this. This is basically our viewport or our HUD context that it's going to use. They all have that. They all have a tint, so we can adjust like the color of the lines, the color of our text, the color of the box we have here, and then they basically all have a position. Draw lines has an array of points, and we'll talk about that shortly, but it basically is going to act very much like draw line, so we'll play with that one first just to kind of introduce some of this. So right now I have draw line hooked up. I'm going to connect the context. I'm going to leave position A at 0, 0, and I'm going to make position B 200, 200. So we're going to go 200 pixels in the Y and 200 pixels in the X. And if I compile this and play, we will see that we now draw a line from 0 to 200, 200. And it's going exactly that direction. If I scale my screen, it's mostly independent. You'll notice it's primarily independent. It starts acting a little bit funky when I get closer like this, but even then, it still is it's still not caring about my scaling. So you can see that the position values we're being given, or we're giving this, are very much a absolute pixel value. So keep that in mind anytime you're drawing with it. Draw lines is very similar. If I give myself an array here that I can work with as an example, I can plug this one in, make sure I connect the context. We'll make this one a different color, say like a bluish color, and I will add in a couple extra values to it. So we'll go from 0, 0 to, let's make this 150. Then we'll go to 50, 100. And then finally we will end at 300, 300. And what we're going to see is that our line is going to make a line from point 0 to point 1, and then from point 1 to point 2, then from point 2 to point 3. Just like that. And you can see, so you can see that if you give it an array, it's basically going to connect it in a continuous line of each point. Draw text and draw box are a little bit different. We're going to look at those now. Draw text is the more straightforward one, so we'll talk about that first. I can just connect this up here. And I'll leave this position as 0, 0 initially. We're going to just make text. I will type in hello. I'll leave the font size at 16, but I am going to select a specific font, Droid Sans Mono. And if I hit play, we can now see in the upper hand corner we have hello. If I change that position, 200, 200, again it will start in the upper left hand corner for our text and position it 200, 200. So just like that, we can kind of then dynamically position text anywhere on the screen that we want to. Draw box is a little different. Draw box, we need to then give context, but we have to give it a brush. And if you take a look here, the tooltip, it says it wants a slate brush asset object reference, which there are none to begin with, so we need to make one. So I'm going to go ahead and up here, I'm going to make myself a new slate brush. You can find this over in user interface. And I will type in new slate brush. And if we jump inside here, we can take a look and see that we have image, preview, a couple of the settings. So I'm going to go ahead and apply just a general texture. Here's our little green dude for an icon that we can add in. If I expand the preview, we can see what happens as this thing kind of gets scaled around, basically, what it's going to look like. So if I, instead of using center, if I go to fill, oops, make sure this is box, fill, we can see how it's going to scale it and such. And an interesting note for this is that on box, if you add the margin section here, so like the top and the bottom, for example, I will do 0.1. Let's make that 0.2, and I will do 0.2 on the bottom as well. You'll notice then that only the sections in between, I might want to make that a little bit more obvious. There's some eyes. It's the sections only, it's the sections basically inside of all these dotted lines that as our potential slate brush here, it gets scaled, will be changed. So this can be used for situations where you have text boxes and stuff and you want like a fancy thing running around it. For our purposes, or for my purposes, I'm actually going to leave this completely empty and blank. I'm just going to revert everything back to its defaults. And that's what I'm going to leave it at. I just kind of, I needed a slate brush that I could put here, just leave it like that. Specifically so that I can leave this and I can then make a actual kind of background. So if I do this for the box, for example, I can get a black box here. And I'll put it at 200, 200. And I'll make it size 10 by 50. Hit compile and hit play. And we can see that we now have a 10 by 50 box. Little black box. I think I can actually, make this none. I think it will still work. No, you do need to have something selected for an actual brush. So let me reverse this then. I'm gonna make this 110. No, I'll make that 20. You can see I have now this text here, hello. And so I can do here is I can then bring down that alpha level, and now we kind of have this little kind of grayish see-through background for our hello or our text to exist inside. And I could position these guys wherever I wanted to on screen. Now, to dynamically then change these, we need to bring in some information from the screen, so we're going to have to set a couple things up here. But you want to avoid doing as much as you can, ideally inside of OnPaint, because like I said earlier, this is very much an on-tick situation. So you want to avoid things like get all actors of type, which for this demonstration, you know what, we will try to actually avoid this if possible. And yeah, we'll design this if we can without that. So the second half of this is going to be us making that Diablo style example that we saw, that where the text is going to pop up next to items, and we'll be able to see what the items actually are.